is an interesting space. Okay. Happy New Year, everyone. Can you all hear me? What do I speak in this one? I don't know. This is complicated. Okay, I'm going to talk from this one. Hopefully this works, because then I can move around. All right. All right. Okay. First, a big thanks to Dr. Manning and the organizing committee for putting together another amazing Battle of New Orleans symposium. Thank you. It's been a great honor and privilege to be part of this community. So for us humble researchers and diehard history buffs here in this room, it remains astounding that just about when you start asking yourself, after all these years talking about the Battle of New Orleans, what else is left there? Is there anything new? Just then you realize there's a whole new set of data that you've never heard of. So it seems we are here on a never-ending journey. So this year I was specifically asked to speak one more time on the role of the free men of color in the war effort of the winter of 1814, 1815. I had originally another lecture in mind of another fellow Mason that was not mentioned. I wanted to show you a series of very interesting historical military drawings that I've come across by Barthélemy Lafon. And God willing, I will present you this material next time. But for now, I gladly will do what I've been asked to, the free people of color. So now let's see. Ooh. Okay. And here they are. 2 years ago at our last symposium, I made my case that the quote, quote, real reason for Andrew Jackson's surprise victory on January 8, 1815 was that he had superior engineers. That is, of course, aside from the intervention of the Holy Mother and the alliance with Jean Lafitte. All of us, all Catholics here in the room, know very well that it was the intervention of Our Lady of Prompt Succor, our state saint, who has saved us. We know that. And just like all of us, all historians here in the room, we are all convinced that it was the powerful artillery of the Barratarian privateers that made all the difference, right? Nevertheless, I was able to demonstrate that without the solid breastwork along the Rodrigue Canal, American cannons and soldiers would have sunk into the mud, just like the British, in fact, did. The amazing American victory at this battle was crucially depending not only on military bravery and heavy-duty artillery, but also on engineering structures that were put into place almost overnight by hundreds of enslaved workers at the instructions of two superbly trained French military engineers who had made New Orleans their home, Arsène Lacarrière-Latour and Barthélemy Lafon, my favorite. Okay, hence, one could argue that it was Jackson's phenomenal engineers that tipped the scales into his favor and allowed for this spectacular victory on the Chalmette battlefield on January 8, 1815. To strengthen my argument, I pointed out that on the West Bank, Team Latour and Lafon, with their strange accents and rather small physique, ran into substantial discrimination and resistance. They were thus unable to do their magic in terms of military fortifications, and sure enough, that's where the British scored their biggest success. I guess the point I was trying to make, yes, even among Yankee doodling Americans, little French engineers with weird accents did matter. So now this time around, we get to these people here. I want to return to a subject that has preoccupied me for nearly all my adult life, the unique role of free people of color in New Orleans history and culture. So I'm going to revisit in the following once again the contributions of the free people of color to the Battle of New Orleans, a topic that I have covered in various incarnations here in Chalmette. As always, I will come up with some fresh new data. Since in antebellum America, people of African descent in general were commonly perceived to be enslaved and not free, and most of them were indeed in bondage and not free, I will also offer a summary of the numerous ways enslaved people were deployed in this war. But by now, various researchers have established that slaves, enslaved auxiliary workers, I prefer the term enslaved for slaves. That's how I was trained. In most schools right now, you don't use the word slave anymore because it's an object. When you use enslaved, you're forced to put the agency into play. An enslaved worker, you got the worker. An enslaved maid, you have the maid. So you have more information on them if you put their work enslaved in it. So that's, but I get corrected all the time when I say, oh, the enslaved workers. Oh, you mean the slaves? Yes, I mean the slaves, but I don't use that term. Okay. All right. So these enslaved auxiliary workers served in numerous functions, including active combat, and made ubiquitously major contributions. They worked, fought, and died there, and made tremendous sacrifices on both sides. Because guess what? There were black troops on both sides. So, and in this context, So in this context, I want to call attention to Dr. Jean Smith. Jean Kelly, that's the dancer. Okay, to Dr. Jean Smith's seminal work. We owe this esteemed historian from Texas Christian University and curator of history at the Fort Worth Museum of Science and History the first comprehensive scholarly study on the role of people of African descent in the War of 1812, called The Slaves' Gamble, Choosing Sides in the War of 1812. Wait. So, this must-read book, in this must-read book, Smith, I'm sorry, I'm just such a teacher. You know, I used to teach, and when people talk, I'm always curious, what do they say? So when people right in front of me start talking very loud, I immediately start listening. I'm sorry about that. So in this must-read book, well, I have it in my pocket, Smith provides us with a fascinating historical analysis of daunting scope. He carefully examines complex data across the North American continent, from fights at the Canadian border to battles along the eastern seaboard, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And here, I apologize, I should have turned this off. Sorry. And of course, all of you all who were here for the bicentennial conference, he blessed us with a wonderful lecture here on exactly this topic, and I see some notes. It was a fascinating lecture. His research focuses primarily on the enslaved people on both sides of the war, as the title of his book suggests. But what about the slaves, Dr. Smith? That was the impetus for this work. One of his students asked him that question, and they wanted to know what their role in the war was, in the War of 1812. He was embarrassed and had no answer, and that sparked his interest. And he's been researching this ever since. Because, as he points out, the Americans and the British alike were vying for the allegiance of the enslaved African Americans. Just like they were vying for the pirates, as we just heard, they were vying for the allegiance of the enslaved Americans. So to entice them into their service, the British came up with deceitful promises, but the Americans did the same thing. Neither side ever intended to keep their promises. The British decided divide and conquer. That was their primary prerogative. They did that throughout the colony. So if you study British history, wherever they go, divide and conquer, play them out against each other. You know, they try to play the pirates against each other. We see it especially in the Creek Wars. In the Creek Wars, we had, you know, a Native American nation that was basically interested in staying where they are and being happily peaceful in their ancestral homeland. But then the British, you know, told them, well, you know, those Americans sent settlers here and disturb you. Can you attack them? And so they did, and then we know the rest of the history. Andrew Jackson came down and pretty much erased them from history. So the British, like most Americans, thought most black people in the United States are enslaved, and all enslaved people want to be free. Hence, if we, the British, will offer them freedom, what they desire most, in exchange for fighting on our side, they will run from the Americans and join us. That was their idea. And that's where Smith's gamble comes in. According to him, they had two choices. Do we want to stay here with the Americans, who definitely abuse us now, but maybe if we prove ourselves and fight really hard in this war, they will reward us later and set us free as equal citizens? Or do we forget about the Americans altogether? They will never treat us right. Here's our chance. If we defect to the British, they are more likely to free us in exchange for joining them in this war. So Smith shows that some choices, some choose, you know, that was kind of the gamble that he said. Some gamble, they choose to stay, others ran to the British. Either way, Smith makes clear it was a gamble, and it didn't look good for the enslaved Africans, no matter where they went. Both the British and the Americans did abolish the transatlantic slave trade, but neither one, that was in 1808, but neither one had any intentions to abolish slavery. You know, the economy is stupid. If we don't have to pay our workers, you know, we get rich. So in the end, Smith concludes the enslaved African Americans didn't much care. That's his conclusion at the end of the book. The enslaved African Americans didn't care much for either side. They just wanted to be free, live their lives safely and in dignity, and have some opportunity that were open to their white counterparts. So that's basically his conclusion. And in a gist, so, you know, that's where he's going. And he comes up with some data, and it's peculiar that from all the places where there was a large enslaved population, from all the places, Louisiana had almost no enslaved people. Less than 300 defected to the British. So that is pretty much what we have on a big plantation. So that's almost nothing. So that sparked my interest. Does this gamble hypothesis really apply to us here in Louisiana? So don't get me wrong. Please read this book, right? It's filled with detailed, important information, but it's definitely not written with us in mind. Smith's book is clearly based on circumstances in Anglo-Protestant America, which is based on British cultural and legal heritage. Strictly segregated, all blacks are slaves, and over there, all whites are free, and over here. That's pretty much what we have in an Anglo-based setting. Everything is segregated. We have that in India, and we don't have it in Latin-based settings, based on the Spanish, the French, and the Portuguese. They didn't do that. So that's why I think here in Louisiana, with its French, Spanish, Catholic past, we are here significantly different from the rest of the United States. As of the decisive Battle of New Orleans, we all know that was much more than Chalmette, January 8th. You know, we've heard this over and over in every lecture. You know, it lasted for several months and, you know, covered 300 miles of territory. we are talking here about Jackson's stubborn determination to get rid of the British in the United States once and for all. But in this context, Smith does mention the two battalions of free people of color, and he gives them all kind of details, but his analysis doesn't really fit, you know. So does it really do justice to us here in Louisiana? Do these two battalions of free people of color, he mentions them, but in his analysis, in the end, in his conclusion, they don't come up anymore. Louisiana doesn't fit at all into the picture. So now let's begin here. Let's look into what I found out about them. Yeah, here we are back. This is, by the way, a student group of in Chalmette that reenacted the two free people of color battalions. Here, I think it was in 2010. That's when this picture is coming from. Okay, so long before General Colin Powell became the commander-in-chief of the U.S. troops in Iraq and later served as the first African-American Secretary of State of the United States in America, we already had black soldiers fighting for our country. And as we shall see, some of them held already in the early 19th century distinguished military leadership positions, albeit not as high as that of General Powell's. So according to a common misconception, the famous two battalions of free men of color that are reenacted here, that served under Andrew Jackson bravely in the Battle of New Orleans, this conception says that this marks the first time in the history of the United States that black troops were deployed in active combat. That's not true. Fake news, we call it today. So it's not true for the United States, and it's not true for Louisiana. As of the United States, thousands of black soldiers were already enlisted in the Continental Army, fighting the British during the American Independence War. And yes, most of them were sent into active combat, fighting vigorously and fearlessly. As of Louisiana, we can pride ourselves that black troops have been deployed in every conflict the region has ever faced, whether under the French, the Spanish, or under American rule. Nevertheless, somehow our country and our great state of Louisiana seem to suffer from a strange case of public amnesia. The same persistently recurring ugly prejudices against black soldiers keep popping up each time there's another war. Time and time again, contradicting vast historical evidence, their valor as soldiers and their allegiance to their white superiors is strangely put into questions and becomes grounds for endless discrimination and rejection. Do they really fight? Are they brave? Where does that come from? No, the two famous all-black battalions of free men of color in Jackson's motley American crew, counting roughly 650 soldiers, were not the first black troops in the service of the United States. Nor would they be the last, and sadly, just like generations of brave African-American soldiers enlisted in the military of the United States of America before and after them, they faced widespread marginalization and oppression, not only during the battle, but especially once the war was over and they returned back to civilian life. So that gets us to Louisiana. Louisiana's two battalions of free men of color in the War of 1812 deserved special mention both for their notoriety and considerable significance. In fact, Louisiana's black military history was, from the onset, somewhat different from other places in the United States. So in that's why we need to look in the history here. They were different. So whenever Louisiana was endangered, There's a quote actually here, we got. Whenever Louisiana was endangered, whether as a colony, province, territory, or state, black troops were used for its security. That's the quote there. Beginning under the French as slave soldiers, these troops under the Spanish emerged as colored militia, and under America developed first into battalions of free men of color, then into regiments of native guards. And I just see somebody who enacts the native guards. Wonderful. And finally, into the Corps d'Afrique, a development unprecedented and unique in America. So in their military role, black troops left an enduring legacy to Louisiana. First, they played a key role in helping France secure and establish the colony of Louisiana. The French, we know, armed their enslaved human property routinely in order to defend their settlement. There are no problems giving them weapons. So second, they played a role in helping the United States win and establish its independence from Great Britain. That was under Spanish colonial rule. Governor Bernardo de Galvez, who gave us St. Bernard Parish, supported the revolutionary Americans against the British Crown and chased the British out of the Gulf region. His powerful troops included entire units of free black soldiers. And by fighting the British again in the War of 1812, this is what we're talking about here, black soldiers in the Battle of New Orleans. And third, they played a role in the Civil War, helping preserve the Union and end slavery. Okay, so that's this quote here. So we know now that by the end of the French period, we had already organized free black troops. We know that because when Alejandro O'Reilly showed up, Bloody O'Reilly, and clears house, on day one, he enlists whole battalions of free people of color as allegiant to the Spanish crown now. So they must have been there before, but they became significant during the Spanish because the Spanish had different laws. The Spanish had a completely different legal system from the French and the Americans. The Spanish were very, very, very Catholic, and every one of their endeavors would be scrutinized by their theologians, and their theologians in Spain came to the conclusion, nobody wants to be enslaved. We wouldn't have thought about that. And so they came up with a compromise. And the compromise is very important. The compromise was called coartación, that's a law. And it means that you can purchase yourself to get your freedom. So please don't think that the Spanish were humanitarians, unlike the others. Their laws were not better. They had a completely different business model. They were thinking, oh God, who works harder? Who works harder? Is it somebody who is going to be enslaved from childbirth to death and all their descendants in all eternity? Or is it somebody who works from 9 to 5? Then afterwards they can work for themselves, gather some money, and eventually buy their own land, buy their own plantation. Who do you think is going to work harder? So it was a different model, and so we went in the Spanish time from less than 2% to about 1/3 of the population, free people of color. They purchased themselves. They were not freed by their masters. A few years for good services, they purchased themselves and became free, established their own homes, had their own business. They were proper property-owning businessmen, businesswomen. The majority of the free people of color in New Orleans were free women. Why? Because domestic labor and the market activities. You have to see the market activities were very, very important. And on the market, you could work for yourself and for your owner. And so you could get the money together because you don't cost too much, and then buy your own house, buy your own market booth, and maybe free all your relatives and buy them houses too. So we had like whole networks of free women of color. They, in change, looked that their kids would have a good schooling and good education. So by the time we became American, we had this group of free people of color that were in place and were different from anything America had ever seen. They were property owning. They had their own, well, this was a system based on slavery. So the basis unit of investment was not a house, but a person. So once you had a person working for free for you, you could gather up some money and buy a house. So yes, these free people of color, most of them, had domestic servants. And when they owned plantation, yes, they also had enslaved field hands. So here we see, oops, my screen disappeared. They were, the military played in this context a particularly important role. The Spanish were a small minority. The French didn't like them because they were not Spanish and they were imposed on them. They never wanted to speak Spanish. Everybody spoke French. So they had them on their throat. Then they wanted to control all those enslaved people. So what did they do? They sided with the free people of color, gave them a lot of power, and these free people of color had their own militia. And that was very different from anything else. These were highly esteemed officers. Some of them had plantations. All of them had property. They were within the community of free black people, completely respected. That was, you know, the up-and-coming group. That was the elite of the free black society, les gens de couleur libre. So Jackson, I'm sorry, they were, oops, I need this one here. That's the one I need. So they classified them as pardos and morenos. That means light-skinned and dark-skinned ones. So they were obsessed with color, just like everybody else. They were enlisted since day one. And Galvez, our superstar under the Spanish, the great Bernardo de Galvez, he used them very much so. And we see from many accounts how much he was defending them, how much he helped them to get free. So he saw to it that anyone who wants to get free did become free. So this group of the free black militia was the main source of upward mobility and elevated social status in Spanish Louisiana. So now, so they were all equal with white people under the rules of His Catholic Majesty, the King of Spain. So, Pierre Lossat, emissary of Napoleon Bonaparte, officially proclaimed the possession of Louisiana for France on November 30th, 1803, and at the same time issued a number of decrees which included provisions regarding the companies of free men of color and their officers. 20 days later, as we all know, so he comes here November 30th, December 1st, he's in office. 20 days later, December 20th, we all know the United States had acquired Louisiana, and the transfer of powers takes place. That includes the free black troops that Napoleon acknowledged as very important. We have to keep in mind Napoleon had black generals under him in the Revolutionary Army and later on throughout his properties worldwide. So these organized and disciplined black troops who had earned an exemplary reputation for their military service under the Spanish were now transferred to the Americans. And here we see already something different. So that was under the Spanish, but now we get to the Americans. They had never seen something like that. So during the first years of American rule, the existence of free black militia became one of the chief, this thing is not good. Technology is only good when it works, so. These free black militia became one of the chief objects of contention between American officials who wanted to liquidate them and the free men of color who desired continued recognition and acceptance in the military. So that was from the day that Claiborne arrived. Claiborne had the challenging task to sort out this dilemma. Having reflected with much anxiety, that's his word, quotes, on this problem, he sought advice of higher authorities and reached out to President James Madison. The distinguished military value of these fine, formerly Spanish free black troops was undeniable, but to recommission them would be considered an outrage by certain parts in the Union, especially in the South. So we are kind of different. The former members of the Spanish Free Black Militia presented the new governor with an impressive petition requesting acceptance into the United States military and promised continued impeccable services. 55 men signed the petition. First, he turned them down, but as the war broke out in 1812 and the news of an impending British attack reached the city in 1814, Claiborne had no choice but support Jackson's desperate rally for troops, any troops that could defend New Orleans, and lifted the restrictions against free people of color's participation in the American military. Okay. So now we get to the promises. In 1812, when conflict between the United States and Britain erupted anew, Louisiana was home to about 8,000 free persons of color, most of whom lived in New Orleans. As British troops approached Louisiana in December 1814, military leaders called upon New Orleans' diverse, multicultural, multilingual population to protect the strategic city. Andrew Jackson issued a direct appeal to the town's free men of color, promised them equal treatment during and after their services. So this gets us to Andrew Jackson. We just heard who he was. We had a good description by Ron Chapman of our free people of color, so we don't, of our Andrew Jackson, who was, to say the least, a controversial guy. You know, he later became our great 7th president, but most places where I go, they describe him as a vicious thug because they could never forgive him what he's done to the Creek Indians. And yes, I'm kind of conflicted as a historian because war is always bloody. War was always vicious. War always aims for kill. And so I guess he was praised as the great killer and at the same time vilified as the great killer for the same thing. Well, if you are a great general and completely ruthless in your approach, how to kill the enemy, it's a two-edged sword. You know, I think the vice was also his greatest glory. You know, so it's kind of I can't condemn him. It's like when you condemn a crocodile for eating the duck. You know you can't. If somebody is like that, he's like that, and he gets praised and condemned for the same reason. So he was nevertheless unbelievably charismatic, a brilliant military strategist, and a highly determined, shrewd politician who could masterfully mobilize the masses to follow him. And that was exactly what demoralized, frightened Louisiana needed to even dare fighting the British. That was an enemy that looked a few sizes too big for us. So you see, they needed this man, and everything turned around once he showed up. So, and we just heard how he got the Baratarians on his side. He had his secret weapon, you know, the shake of the Masons. So let's see what he used here to get the free people on his side. Or did he even need them on his side? So let's look into that. And that gets us to the proclamation. This proclamation was published everywhere in the territory, so all around New Orleans. So, and it is significant enough to read the whole thing, because it will come up when we look into the data. Here he says, through a mistaken policy, you have heretofore been deprived of participation in the glorious struggle for national rights in which our country is engaged. This no longer shall exist. As sons of freedom, you are now called upon to defend our most inestimable blessing. As Americans, your country looks with confidence to her adopted children for a valorous support. as a faithful returns for the advantages enjoyed under her mild and equitable government, as fathers, husbands, and brothers, you are summoned to rally round the standard of the eagle to defend all which is dear in existence. Okay, so that's what I quoted up there, but it continues, and then he comes up with the details that we can prove with data. Okay, your country, although calling for your exertions, does not wish you to engage in her cause. Without amply remunerating you for the services rendered. So we will help you, we will pay you well. Your intelligent minds, how about that? Your intelligent minds are not to be led away by false representation. He knew the British were also trying to get them. Your love of honor would cause you to despise the man who should attempt to deceive you. Don't listen to the British. In the sincerity of a soldier and the language of the truth, I address you. To very noble-hearted, generous freemen of color, volunteering to serve during the present contest with Great Britain, and no longer, there will be paid the same bounty in money and land now received by white soldiers of the United States. That means 124 in money and 160 acres of land. The non-commissioned officers and probated will also be entitled to the same monthly pay and the same rations and clothes furnished to any American soldier. On enrolling yourselves in companies, the Major General, that's him, commanding will select officers for your government from your white fellow citizens. The non-commissioned officers will be appointed from among yourselves. Due regard will be paid to the feelings of freemen and soldiers. You will not, by being associated with white men in the same corps, be exposed to improper comparisons and unjust sarcasm. That's interesting. As a distinct, independent battalion or regiment pursuing the path of glory, you will, undivided, receive the applause and gratitude of our countrymen. That's how he justifies segregation. So,
you get into the great things, but if
we're at the end of time.
Over time, so just hit the highlights of the good stuff, so we don't cut into lunch too much. I know it's hard. I know you're just getting the good stuff.
Okay, we're getting the idea. What he said, he justified segregation. He justified equal pay. He justified equal. That's the proclamation. So here we see nothing but white folks and one enslaved person. That's not how it was. That's a famous picture. So now let's look fast. Very quickly, I'm going to rush through this. We had at least not 650, we had at least over 1,000 free men of color enlisted in U.S. troops. I'm still finding more every time I go up to the National Archives. 650 I have proof of in 2 all-black battalions of free persons of colors. And that's the ones I'm talking here. And I looked into additional free black troops. There was one more smaller unit under Lemel. There were people all over the place, from the river parishes to Opelousas and other places. So now we also know there were enslaved workers everywhere. They dug out the canals. They hauled stuff back and forth. They did everything. In the city, they did everything but tend to the fields, because there was no time for fields. They had to protect the country. So now, let's look. That's the battlefield. Here we can see where they were. They were right here, the 2 units of free people of color, right here in the middle. 1st Battalion and the 2nd Battalion both were mustered in December 16th, when everybody else was mustered in. Discharged March 25th. That is very unusual. That's pretty much the latest. They were the last ones to be sent off. Why? Jackson liked them from the start. He fell in love with them when he saw them. He saw their Spanish uniforms. He saw their French uniforms. He saw their attitude So he wanted a second battalion. So the first one was mustered in under Pierre Lacoste. Yes, they had to have a white guy on top, but that one knew that, this one was in charge. Vincent Populus, Vincent Populus, as he would have said. Okay, so this battalion has a total of 356 black men with 2 racially unclassified medics and 2 white leaders, 360 altogether. The second one is similar, has a few less, and less leaders, less in every category. The pay, this is interesting. The pay. The major, the second, and the first one get the same pay. Lacoste, the white dude, and Vincent Populus got the same. Okay, so let's look into here. The surgeons, which I find very interesting, the surgeon get the highest pay. He's paid on a general level, actually. When you look at the generals, they get paid. The surgeon's mate gets 45. Quartermasters, adjutants, captains, they're all on the $40 range. The lieutenants, if it's first lieutenant, on $30. Second lieutenants, 25. Third lieutenants, 23.11. Yeah, I don't know. The sergeants, 11. The corporals, 10. The privates, 8. Okay. There's still some people left. Okay, so you want me to continue? Yes. Okay. All right. So this was throughout Jackson's operation. That was the pay rate. So the question is, does the pay rate apply to our guys? And here's the fact. I pulled every one of their muster rolls. All 650 plus, all of them of the Orleans battalion under Plauchet to have a comparison, a wide comparison. Okay, I found out Michel Forchier, the colonel, who organized the 2 free black troops. He got 60, okay? The first major, Pierre Lacoste, and Vincent Populus, the second major, got the same. White and color got the same. The surgeon, Mr. Miltenberger, I have no idea what he was. I have no information on him. He got the same pay. Quartermaster Joseph Cabaret and François Chatry, the adjutant, got $40. But here we have Cabaret, Joseph Cabaret's quartermaster muster roll. This is what he got altogether, 170. We have 6 captains. Now that's a lot of captains when you compare the units otherwise. The first one is Basile de Mazilière. That's a real estate owner, pretty big builder and real estate owner. Got 40. All the others here got 40. So now let's go to the next one. Here we have Basile de Mazilière's muster roll. And this is very interesting because you see here that this is what he got for himself at the rate of for 99 days. But he didn't get anything for a horse, but he got clothing for his servant that came with him. And he got also paid for rations for himself and for his servants. And interestingly, he got a food allowance for 3 meals a day, the servant for 1 meal a day. And he got paid for all of that. He brought his enslaved servant with him, just like the white officers. Okay, before this battle, U.S. forces never had anyone mustered in on the lieutenant level, so that was new to this battle. So there was something new, not that soldiers fought in combat, but that they were high-ranking officers. So here we have the 9 first lieutenants, all of them get their $20. More de Mazilières, here we have Balthazar de Mazilière, and more Populus. You see there is another family member. Here is Maurice Populus. And there we have Joseph Fouché, who is the brother of Modeste Fouché, who is the common law partner of the great engineer, Barthélemy Lefond, that I talked to you last year. So we have a family affair here. I think 6 of his black family members are fighting in this battle. Here we have the second lieutenants, get the same thing as white folks. We have some honorees here, just like General Honoré, who came to save us after Hurricane Katrina. We have a third lieutenant and ensign, Then we have two order sergeants, Doliols, great builders. Brion, that was an uncle of Modeste Fouché. So same family again. Duparts, they are related to Marie Laveau. Populus, Samoa. Rouzan, we all know Wanda Rouzan, the great musician. Corporals, we have 25 altogether. I just put out the families that we're familiar with. Forchier, that's a black relative of the big boss. Maybe a direct relative, we don't know. So those are the secrets we have, right? Felix and Jean-Baptiste Populus, Samoa Populuses. And Arak, that's also a relative of Marie Laveau and Henriette Delille. Trevine, Paul Trevine, the great journalist, that's his father. We have here the musicians. And there's no other battalion in the entire army of Jackson that has more musicians. 11 musicians. Wow. First, a man called Jean-Baptiste. Then we have Hazur, one of the mothers of the leaders of the Sisters of the Holy Family was a Mother Hazur. And here we have some Tremés. Apparently he has not always seen his wife. Mr. Tremé had some other options. So, privates. We have altogether 247. We see some more people here that are interesting. Auguste, related to Marie Laveau. Beaulieu, that's 10 of them. Bali, that's father and son. They served already under the Spanish. More Beaulieu. Bienvenus, tons of them. I don't have this in my... Somebody doesn't... Are you leaning? No, what's happening? Are we...
No, we're good.
That's it.
Now there's no hurry. Now we got plenty of time. So yeah, I don't know what happened with the...
Oh, wait. Invite me back. I finished the whole thing. But you see, I have data. I'm going to summarize what I have, the rest of it. I have data that proves that Andrew Jackson made it true. He really paid them all exactly for what any white guy would get. And he apparently loved them so much, he kept them until the very last minute. So everything was already organized. They had already the peace treaty in time. He waited until he had proof that the British had left from the Gulf. By the end of March, they were gone. So he waited. He trusted these guys more than anyone else, which is astounding when you think of the aftermath. After he left, that's when all hell breaks loose. So they got the same pay as everyone else. But then it got really ugly. Because when we saw the podium's discussion at the end of yesterday, we saw a lot of evaluation. What did that war really do? When it comes to people of color, black Americans, it was a consolidation of the institution of slavery. It was the planters' won. It was definitely a total loss for all advances made before for equality, freedom, and justice. So, and that we see in that time we call the antebellum time until the end of the Civil War, they are incredibly discriminated. They do not get their bounty land. Well, okay. Well, I'm just going to run Doliols. We have more Doliols here. Builders, more Boidois, also builders. And there's a Forstal. It's the relative of a big plantation from Forchiers. Fouchés, these are more siblings of Mrs. Modeste Fouché. We have Narcisse Laveau, the uncle of Marie Laveau. Mandeville, relative of yours truly, Bernard Marigny de Mandeville. Yeah, well, that's the one that we always hear from the historian of St. Bernard Parish. Okay, and here you see 5 Populus. You see 5 Pierres. You see Populus, more Populus. They were a big clan. Here we have one example. This is from the private record. Dollier, Felix Delille, I told you about him. This is literally the brother of Henriette Delille, the great founding mothers of the Sisters of the Holy Family. We have servants, altogether 21 servants. Servant is a euphemism for enslaved people. And now it gets very interesting. 6 of them got paid. 7, actually. 7 of them got paid. And 1 got paid through the officer. That was the one whose record I showed you. Basile de Marzilliers, Captain Basile de Marzilliers' record. So why were some paid and why were others not paid? I have no answer. The second group has the same thing, leadership of some Michel Fouché performer on top of them. Louis Daquin is white, but then everyone else is black. Joseph Savary was de facto in charge. So they had 5 captains instead of 6. And they had, here's the comparison. So they had less lieutenants, they had less second lieutenants, they had more third lieutenants, they had less sergeants, less corporals, less musicians, less privates, less servants, and they had also paid servants. Why, I don't know. So the musicians are a little bit different. We have here drummers and 1 fifer, and every captain has a drummer, and we know who went with which captain. Okay, so the most surprising facts here are they were completely equal. Claiborne asked for property-owning men to serve in the war. These were property-owning men, and they were asked for duty, and they reported to duty. They were segregated. It was an all-black battalion, just like Andrew Jackson asked for. They did receive the same pay. High-ranking officers brought their enslaved servants. Some enslaved servants in the battalion were paid at the rank of a private. Now, this is stunning. These enslaved servants were paid at the same rank as in the Orleans battalion, some sons of big plantation owners who had no military experience and were just mustered in on the private rank. So I found that mind-boggling. The musicians, of course, for us in New Orleans are very important, and I found it interesting that senior musicians were paid at the corporal level. The sergeant's level. They were not paid on the private's level, so they were cherished. Without music, nothing works. So I'm gonna go continue. This just shows the bravery that they were everywhere for. And here is, of course, Lionel Baptiste, the great drummer that we know today. One of the Baptiste family, maybe a direct descendant of this Jean Baptiste, who was the lead in the musicians, is now endearing us all on the Stephen Colbert show, because he is a great musician and he became a national celebrity now. Broken promises. Yeah, well, the broken promises, I already told you, they never got what they were promised. They were not treated as equal citizens. They weren't even allowed to parade in the victory parade. Yeah, the Americans didn't allow them to parade in the victory parade. So it's unbelievable what happened. Now, we see maybe best what happened to the in terms of broken promises is when we look at the most famous black man at the battle, Jordan Noble. No, it was not the great Major Savary that became internationally known. It was this old man. And he was just 14 years old at the Battle of New Orleans. He was a child. He had no musket and no rifle. He had a drum, and there's his drum. But he reached the age of 90, and that's why he became so famous. He was later on allowed to be in the parade, and as such, he became a local celebrity. And he lived long enough until Reconstruction, until the 1870s, to be one of the few people who ever get their pension. He didn't get the bounty land, but at least he got the pension for his services in the battle. So here's some information about him. I already told you. He served. So what happened to him? After the Battle of New Orleans, he was still enslaved. No, he didn't get free. Then he went through 2 more owners until he was finally free decades later. He served in 3 more wars. He served in the Seminole War. he served in the Mexican War, and he served in the Civil War on both sides, first under the Confederacy and then for the Union. So this man really did it all. He served longer than anyone else, and only because he endured and was persistent, he actually reaped the fame that he eventually got as an old man. When he died, there was everywhere newspaper articles about the great old Jordan and what a great drummer he was. But they said, oh, he drummed in Daquin's Free Men of Color Battalion. Nope. He was the property of a white man and fought in a white battalion. So broken promises over and over and over. Here we have an enactment of, for their bicentennial, somebody played the little boy, and this is Al Jackson, who's working on a biography on him. Here's Al Jackson again. That was the enactors that honored him, and this is a descendant of Jordan Noble. So, well, the point I was trying to make is, at the Battle of New Orleans, the reason why our Gene Smith doesn't work here, his theory doesn't apply at all, is number one, Louisiana has a completely different fabric of population. The segregation didn't work here. I just showed you. They were all related. We are all cousins, whether we admit it or not. We're cousins, or second cousins, or third cousins, or fourth cousins. And we are a family when it comes to an enemy that wants to invade us. So you can't tell us, go over here and go over there, and no British can come and tell us it's better over there. This is family, this is home, we defend our family. So both the leadership would have had a better approach to the black troops and would be much more readily to identify with them. And as well, the troops would much more readily identify with their home country that they're not gonna desert. Free people of color, property-owning free people of color didn't exist anywhere else. That was the only place in the United States where this existed, because we had both French and Spanish heritage. And so they were radically different. So back to Gene Smith, two things. When it comes to Jordan Noble, he was born in Georgia. He came down here with an Anglo owner, had two more Anglo owners until he finally got free. It applies for him. So no wonder Gene Smith loves him. He says he's now working on a biography on him. So I'm not sure whether he's making that true or not, but I can see why he loves him, because his theory applies to him. The free people of color, he doesn't know what to do with them. They're kind of an afterthought in his book, because nothing they are representing applies to Gene's theory. All right, this is it. Thank you so very much for doing overtime with me.